So what would happen if a state like New Hampshire decided to make some pretty major tax cuts right before a recession hits? Well, today, that's exactly what we're going to dig into. We're looking at a fiscal stress test that basically models how a few proposed policy changes could shake up the state's finances and, maybe more importantly, the local services that you and I rely on every single day.
Okay, first things first. To really get this, you need to understand something kind of unique about New Hampshire. A massive, 70% of public school funding comes from local property taxes. That is way, way more than most other states. So why does this matter so much? Well, it means that any squeeze on the state's budget, it doesn't just stay in Concord. Nope, it immediately puts pressure on your town, your schools, and yeah, you guessed it, your property tax bill.
And really, that's the core question we're trying to answer here. When the state decides to cut its revenue, where do those ripples end up? What does it actually mean for the schools, the police, the fire departments right there in your community?
And there's another big pressure point we have to talk about: demographics. New Hampshire is the second oldest state in the entire country. And think about it. An older population naturally needs more services, things like healthcare and long-term care. And guess what? Those services are some of the absolute biggest items in the state budget. So you've got this constant underlying tension already built into the system.
So, what's the state's emergency cushion? Its safety net? It's called the Rainy Day Fund, and it's projected to have about $204 million in it. Now, I know that sounds like a ton of money, right? But for an entire state budget, it's a pretty limited resource. So let's keep that number in our back pocket because we are about to see just how fast it can disappear.
All right, so now that we've set the stage, let's look at the actual policy choices that were put under the microscope here. These are the big ideas that were on the table: 3 different tax bills, and one really major proposal to change the state constitution itself.
So first up, we've got the smallest proposal of the bunch, just a little trim to the business enterprise tax, or the BET as it's known. The estimated impact, a revenue loss of about $20 million a year. That's a decent chunk of change for sure, but as you're about to see, it is just the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, next, the proposals start to get a lot bigger. This next bill would get rid of that same business enterprise tax, but completely, like repeal it entirely. So now we're not talking $20 million, we're talking about a $200 million hole in the budget every year. That's 10 times bigger than the first cut.
But hold on, because the largest proposal is in a completely different league. We're talking about repealing the business profits tax, and the number here is just staggering. We're talking about eliminating $1 billion in revenue every single year. To put that into perspective for you, that's about a third of the state's entire general fund. Just gone.
All right, now for the other big idea. This one isn't a tax cut, it's a spending limit. It's a proposed constitutional amendment called CACR 18. And in simple terms, it would basically create a permanent rule that says state and local governments can only increase their spending by a tiny amount each year, tied strictly to inflation and population changes.
So what's the big difference here? Well, right now, your elected legislators, they're the ones who decide on spending levels in the budget. But under this proposal, CACR 18, that spending would be automatically capped, locked in. So if the state or even your own town needed to spend more to meet a growing need, let's say for schools or for healthcare, it couldn't just happen. It would require a direct vote from the public. It's a fundamental change to the rules of the game. Okay, so we have the policy choices on one side. Now for the stress test. To see how these ideas would actually perform in the real world, the analysis threw a giant wrench in the works: a moderate, multi-year recession.
And the timing here is absolutely crucial. The model assumes a recession hits just 1 year after these policies go into effect. And this is on purpose, right? It's designed to mimic a real-world crisis, where at the exact moment your tax revenues are plummeting, the number of people who need help is going up. It's the ultimate fiscal squeeze.
So what were the results of this whole experiment? When you combine these big policy choices with a recession, what does the future actually look like? Let's walk through the scenarios and find out.
Let's start with the most conservative change, okay? Just that small $20 million tax cut. Even in this, the mildest scenario, the state eventually hits a wall. The rainy day fund gets totally drained, and by the late 2030s, the state is forced to start making cuts to services.
But now, look what happens when we model the larger $200 million tax repeal. It triggers this really dangerous cascade effect. So step 1, the state has less money coming in. Step 2, the recession hits. That just, poof, drains the entire rainy day fund. And the final step? By fiscal year 2030, the model shows the state simply runs out of money. It literally can't pay its bills. And what about that most extreme proposal, repealing the $1 billion business profits tax? Well, the result is immediate, and it's catastrophic. The budget fails in the very first year. It creates this massive structural deficit that no amount of rainy day funds could ever hope to cover.
Okay, now let's add that spending cap, CACR 18, into the mix. This creates this really bizarre situation that the analysis calls a legal impossibility. So imagine this. Your car's manual says you have to use a certain type of expensive oil, but a new law comes out that says you're not allowed to spend that much on oil. You're stuck, right? You can't follow both rules. Well, that's what could happen here. Federal law requires the state to fund things like Medicaid at a certain level, but the new state constitution would forbid lawmakers from actually spending that much money. They'd be legally trapped.
Okay, so the most crucial point here is connecting all these abstract budget numbers to the real-world services that people actually rely on. Because when a state budget fails, it's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it's felt in communities all across New Hampshire.
Let's take higher education, for example. New Hampshire already ranks dead last, 50th out of 50 states, in how much state support it gives its public colleges. Dead last. And as you can see, it's not just last place by a little bit. It is dramatically below the U.S. average. This really fragile funding situation makes the state's university and community college systems incredibly vulnerable to any kind of budget cuts.
And the direct consequence of that is pretty clear, right? To make up for lost state funding, public colleges would have very little choice but to bring in steep tuition hikes and cut academic programs. And that directly impacts the affordability of college for New Hampshire families and, really, the strength of the state's future workforce.
Then you've got Medicaid. This is the single largest item in the entire state budget. It covers about 13% of all residents, and the state's share costs over $1 billion. But here's the key. It's a federally mandated program. The state has to pay its share. And the real kicker? Demand for it always goes up during a recession, which is the exact moment when money is the tightest.
And all of this brings us right back to where we started, the impact on your local community. When the state cuts aid, that financial burden doesn't just disappear. It shifts down to towns and counties. And that spending cap we talked about, it would also apply to your local school district. So all of this creates a really difficult choice, either raise local property taxes or cut services. And what the analysis found was that in all 8 of the scenarios they tested, local budgets are ultimately the ones that get strained.
Which brings us to the final and most critical question. Look, this analysis doesn't offer an opinion. It just lays out the potential consequences of these choices. So the real question, it's for the people and the policymakers of New Hampshire. When you have less money coming in but more and more people are needing help, how do you choose to balance the books?